The heat in Memphis on August 16, 1977, was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight. It was a stifling, humid blanket that hung over the Mississippi Delta, turning the air into a shimmering haze that smelled of asphalt and dying grass. At 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard, the white limestone columns of the most famous house in America gleamed in the afternoon sun, a blinding contrast to the dark oak trees that stood like sentinels on the lawn. To the tourists pressed against the wrought iron music gates, the house looked like a dream, a southern palace where the king of rock and roll lived in eternal sequined glory. But inside, the air conditioning was humming a low artificial drone, recirculating the oxygen in a home that had effectively become a hermetically sealed capsule. The windows were covered with aluminum foil and heavy velvet drapes, ensuring that not a single photon of the sun could penetrate the interior. For the man who lived upstairs, it was not Tuesday afternoon. It was the middle of his night, or perhaps the beginning of his morning. Time had long ago ceased to have any meaning within these walls. The clocks didn't matter. Only the schedule of the king mattered, and the king lived in the shadows. Downstairs, the house was beginning to stir with the quiet, nervous energy of a tour departure day. The Memphis Mafia, the entourage of bodyguards, cousins, and paid friends who orbited Elvis like moons around a dying planet, were packing bags. The limousines were being prepped. The Lisa Marie, the Convair 880 jet named after his daughter, was waiting on the tarmac at the airport, fueled and ready to fly to Portland, Maine, for the start of another grueling tour. There was a sense of routine to the chaos. They had done this 100 times before. They knew the drill: wait for the boss to wake up, get him into the car, get him on the plane, and keep the bubble intact. But upstairs, in the private sanctuary of the master suite, a space so forbidden that even close friends were terrified to enter without an invitation, the routine had broken. The silence was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of an ending. Elvis Presley was 42 years old, but the man who lay on the floor of his bathroom looked decades older. The face that had once made millions of teenagers scream, the face that was as recognizable as the Statue of Liberty or the Coca-Cola logo, was swollen, distorted by years of prescription drug abuse and the ravages of a body that had turned against itself. He was bloated, weighing nearly 350 pounds, his system fighting a losing war against glaucoma, hypertension, liver damage, and an enlarged colon. He was wearing gold pajamas, the fabric shimmering in the harsh light of the vanity bulbs. He had fallen face forward onto the thick red shag carpet, his knees drawn up to his chest in a fetal position, as if trying to protect himself from a blow that he never saw coming. Beside him, dropped in the moment of collapse, was a paperback book, The Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus. It was a telling detail. In his final moments, the man who was worshipped as a god by the secular world was alone, reading about the search for a savior, perhaps looking for the peace that the pills and the applause could never provide. The discovery was not made by a doctor or a bodyguard, but by Ginger Alden, his 20-year-old fiancée. She had woken up in the master bed, realized he wasn't there, and walked toward the bathroom door. It was around 2 p.m. She knocked. No answer. She pushed the door open. The scene she found was a tableau of absolute horror. The king was blue. His skin was cold. The air in the room was still. She screamed his name, but the sound just bounced off the gold fixtures and the mirrors. The panic that followed rippled through the house like a shock wave. Al Strada, a bodyguard, rushed up the stairs. Then Joe Esposito, the road manager, and Elvis's best man. They turned him over. They tried to find a pulse. They tried to breathe life back into lungs that had already surrendered. The desperation in that room was palpable. Men who had built their entire lives around protecting this one human being were now realizing, with terrifying clarity, that they had failed. They could stop a fan from jumping on stage. They could stop a photographer from getting a shot. But they couldn't stop the inevitable collapse of a man who had been slowly dying in front of them for years. The ambulance was called. "Breathe, Elvis, breathe," Esposito shouted, pumping his chest. But there was no movement. The paramedics arrived, rushing the stretcher through the house, past the jungle room with its green shag carpet on the ceiling, past the pool table with the tear in the felt, out the front door where the white columns stood watch. As the ambulance screamed out of the gates and turned onto Elvis Presley Boulevard, the fans outside watched in confusion. They didn't know that the siren was wailing for the end of an era. They just saw the vehicle speeding toward Baptist Memorial Hospital. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked frantically, intubating him, pushing drugs, trying to restart a heart that had likely stopped hours before. But it was theater. It was a performance for the sake of protocol. The king was gone. Dr. George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, the man who had written thousands of prescriptions for the pills that littered the shelves of Graceland, arrived at the hospital in his own car. He was part of the tragedy, a central figure in the web of chemical dependency that had ensnared Elvis. When the doctors in the emergency room finally called it, when they stopped the CPR and pulled the sheet up, the room fell into a stun. It was 3:30 p.m. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, a man who had buried his wife Gladys 19 years earlier and never recovered, now had to bury his only son. His wail of grief echoed through the sterile hospital corridors. Primal sound of a father who had outlived his legacy. "My son is dead," he cried. "Everything is gone." Back at Graceland, the news hit the house like a physical blow. The maids, the cooks, the security guards, people who had spent years tiptoeing around the king's moods, collapsed in weeping heaps. But amidst the grief, the machinery of the Elvis empire began to grind. The gates had to be secured. The press had to be handled. The autopsy had to be arranged. The secrecy that had defined his life continued into his death. The family immediately moved to lock down the master suite. The bedroom, the bathroom, the dressing area. It was all sealed off. Nothing was to be touched. The book on the floor, the unmade bed, the half-empty cup of water. It was all frozen in time, preserved as a shrine to the moment the music stopped. But to truly understand the darkness of this moment, we have to look beyond the biological fact of death. We have to look at the psychological architecture of the scene. Elvis Presley died in a bathroom. It is a detail that has been the subject of cruel jokes for decades, but in reality, it is the most tragic symbol of his life. The bathroom was the only place where he was truly alone. It was the only room with a lock that he controlled. For 20 years, Elvis had belonged to the world. His face was on lunchboxes, his voice was on the radio, his body was the property of the ticket-buying public. Even inside Graceland, he was surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, a group of men who lived with him, ate with him, and watched him sleep. He had no privacy. He had no solitude. The bathroom was his reading room, his library, his escape pod. It was a comfortable, oversized room with a black leather armchair, a telephone, and piles of books on religion, spirituality, and metaphysics. It was where he went to think, and it was where he went to die. The tragedy of August 16th is not just that a rock star overdosed, it is that a man who had everything, money, fame, talent, adoration, had constructed a life so isolating that he essentially suffocated within his own success. Graceland was supposed to be his castle, but by 1977, it had become his prison. He was a captive in a gilded cage, trapped by his own fame, unable to go out for a hamburger, unable to walk down the street, unable to have a conversation with a stranger that wasn't mediated by his celebrity. He was bored, he was lonely, he was in physical pain, and he was surrounded by people who were on his payroll, people who were terrified to say no to him. The yes men had loved him to death. They had fetched the pills, they had closed the drapes, they had fed the delusions, because that was their job. And in doing so, they had helped build the walls that eventually closed in on him. As the sun began to set on Memphis that evening, the news broke. Dan Rather on CBS, Walter Cronkite, the BBC, the bulletins interrupted regular programming around the globe. The king is dead. The reaction was hysteria. Thousands of people began to converge on Memphis. They abandoned their jobs, their families, their homes, and drove toward the magnetic pull of Graceland. The street outside the mansion became a sea of weeping humanity. They pinned flowers to the gates. They lit candles. They sang his songs in broken, tearful choruses, but inside the house, the body was gone. The master suite was empty. The air conditioning kept humming, cooling the rooms for a man who would never feel the heat again. The autopsy would later reveal the cocktail of drugs in his system: codeine, Percodan, Dilaudid, Quaaludes, Placidil, and much more. It was a pharmacy. It was the chemical crutch he used to get through the night, and then the chemical hammer he used to get through the day. But the drugs were just the symptom. The disease was the life itself. The disease was the Graceland bubble. Elvis had spent his entire adult life trying to build a world where he was safe, where he was loved, where he was in control. He bought the house for his mother. He filled it with his friends. He built the fence. He hired the guards. And in the end, none of it could save him. The fortress he built to keep the world out ended up keeping the help out when he needed it most. The death of Elvis Presley was the final, brutal punctuation mark on the American century. He was the boy from Tupelo who became the king, the embodiment of the American dream. Rise from nothing, conquer the world, buy the big house on the hill. But the scene on the bathroom floor told the darker side of that dream. It told the story of excess, of isolation, of the crushing weight of being an icon. August 16, 1977, was not just the day the music died. It was the day the fantasy of having it all was exposed as a lie. The king lay on the floor, cold and blue, proving once and for all that while you can buy the mansion, and you can buy the plane, and you can buy the entourage, you cannot buy a way out of your own skin. The silence upstairs was heavy, final and absolute. The tour was canceled. The plane would not fly. The king had left the building, not through the stage door, but through the darkness of his own private sanctuary, leaving behind a legacy that would turn his home into the most visited grave in America. To understand why the bathroom floor became the only sanctuary for the most famous man on earth, you have to burn the calendar of 1977. You have to strip away the gold jumpsuits, the prescription bottles, the bloated weight, and the darkness of the shuttered windows. You have to travel back 20 years to a time when the world was in Technicolor, the music was dangerous, and Elvis Presley was not a tragedy, but a nuclear explosion of youth and sex appeal. The year is 1957. The location is still Memphis, but the atmosphere is electric with the shock of the new. Elvis is 22 years old. He is lean. His hair is dyed jet black. His eyes are heavy-lidded and hungry, and he is standing at the center of a cultural hurricane that is tearing the roof off conservative America. He has just appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. He has just released All Shook Up. He is making movies in Hollywood. The money is rolling in like a tidal wave, royalty checks that defied the comprehension of a boy who, just a few years earlier, was driving a truck for Crown Electric for $1 an hour. But amidst the screaming girls and the flashing bulbs, Elvis Presley had a singular, driving motivation that had nothing to do with fame. It wasn't about the cars, although he bought them by the dozen. It wasn't about the clothes, although he dressed like a peacock. It was about a promise. It was about a vow he had made in the dirt-poor poverty of Tupelo, Mississippi, when he was just a child sitting on the lap of the only person he ever truly loved, his mother, Gladys. The bond between Elvis and Gladys Presley was not a normal mother-son relationship. It was a biological and spiritual fusion that bordered on the obsessive. They had survived the Great Depression together. They had survived the humiliation of his father, Vernon's imprisonment for check forgery when Elvis was just a toddler, an event that left Gladys and Elvis alone against the world, clinging to each other in a shotgun shack that often lacked electricity. In those dark nights, Elvis had whispered a promise to her, a mantra that became the engine of his ambition. He told her not to worry. He told her that one day he was going to be rich. He told her he was going to buy her a fine house on a hill, a castle where she would never have to worry about rent or food again. By the spring of 1957, the promise was due. The Presley family had been living in a house on Audubon Drive in Memphis, a nice suburban ranch-style home, but it was under siege. The fans had discovered the address. They were camping on the lawn, stealing blades of grass as souvenirs, peering into the windows, and, effectively, turning the neighborhood into a carnival. The neighbors were furious. Gladys, a woman who was naturally anxious and terrified of the spotlight, was miserable. She felt trapped. She couldn't hang her laundry in the backyard without being photographed. Elvis saw her distress, and he made the decision. He needed a fortress. He needed an estate that offered privacy, dignity, and the grandeur that he felt his mother deserved. He told his parents to go looking. He gave them a blank check and a mandate to find the castle he had promised her in Tupelo. They found it on the outskirts of the city, in an area called Whitehaven, which at the time was miles of rolling farmland and open country. The property was a 13-acre estate owned by the Moore family, prominent Memphis socialites. It was named Graceland, after the original owner's aunt, Grace Toeuf. The house itself was not a palace in the European sense. It was a neoclassical limestone mansion built in 1939, sitting atop a gentle rise of oak trees. It was elegant, imposing, and southern. It had white columns, a broad front porch, and an air of old money permanency. When Gladys saw it, she knew immediately. This was the house on the hill. This was the fulfillment of the prophecy. The negotiation was swift. On March 19, 1957, Elvis Presley purchased Graceland for $102,500. He put down a cash payment and traded in the Audubon Drive house as part of the deal. At 22, he was now the lord of the manor. The move-in day was a celebration of the American dream in its purest, most potent form. The boy who had been looked down upon as white trash was now sleeping in the master bedroom of the finest house in the county. But Elvis didn't just move in, he transformed the space. He wasn't interested in the muted, tasteful beige of the aristocracy. He wanted flash. He wanted rock and roll. He hired decorators to paint the walls in vibrant blues and golds. He installed white carpet that was so deep you sank into it. He built the famous music gates at the bottom of the driveway, custom-wrought iron gates featuring musical notes and a guitar player, a symbol that announced to the world that this was the kingdom of music. The early days at Graceland, the brief golden era of 1957 and early 1958, were the happiest of Elvis's life. The house was not yet a prison, it was a playground. It was a family compound in the truest sense. Elvis moved his parents in, of course, with Gladys, and Vernon taking the bedroom on the main floor, giving Elvis the privacy of the upstairs suite. But he also moved in his grandmother. Cousins, uncles, and friends were constantly coming and going. The gates were often left open. Elvis would ride his horses around the grounds, waving to the fans who lined the fence. He would drive his go-karts down the driveway. He would play touch football on the lawn until the sun went down. There was a lightness to the place, a sense of joy and disbelief that they had actually made it. They were eating high on the hog, safe behind the limestone walls, protected from the poverty that had haunted them for so long. At the center of this universe was Gladys. She was the queen of Graceland. She ran the house. She cooked the meals, heavy, Southern comfort food fried in grease, the only food Elvis really liked. She was the anchor. Elvis would come home from Hollywood or a tour, exhausted and wired, and the first thing he would do was find Gladys. They would talk for hours, often in a private baby talk language that they had used since he was an infant, a dialect of intimacy that excluded everyone else, even Vernon. She was his confidant, his conscience, and his best friend. As long as Gladys was in the kitchen, as long as she was sitting on the porch, Graceland was a home. It was grounded. It had a heartbeat. But the seeds of tragedy were already germinating. The speed of Elvis's life was terrifying, and Gladys was absorbing the stress of it. She was drinking heavily to cope with the anxiety. She was taking diet pills to try and look the part of a star's mother, but her health was deteriorating rapidly. She told a cousin that she was the most miserable woman in the world. She missed the simple life. She missed her privacy. She felt a foreboding doom about Elvis's fame, convinced that the world would eventually destroy him. And then came the letter that every American mother in the 1950s feared, the draft notice. The U.S. Army wanted the king. Elvis was inducted in March 1958. It was a public spectacle, a public relations coup for the Army, but for Gladys, it was a death sentence. The idea of her boy being taken away, sent across the ocean to Germany, stripped of his protection, was more than her fragile constitution could bear. As Elvis went through basic training at Fort Hood in Texas, Gladys's health went into a tailspin. She developed acute hepatitis. Her liver, damaged by alcohol and stress, began to fail. In August 1958, just over a year after moving into the dream house, she was rushed to the hospital in Memphis. Elvis was granted emergency leave. He flew home, rushing to her bedside. The scene at the hospital was a mirror image of the bond they shared. The most famous soldier in the world, the sex symbol of the century, fell to his knees beside her bed, weeping like a child, begging her not to leave him. He told the doctors she was all he lived for. He told them she was his best girl. But the damage was irreversible. On August 14, 1958, a date that would haunt Elvis for the rest of his life. Gladys Presley died of heart failure at the age of 46. The impact of her death on Elvis was cataclysmic. It was a nuclear bomb detonating inside his soul. Witnesses at the funeral described a scene of primal, almost frightening grief. Elvis threw himself onto the casket. He refused to let them close it. He screamed her name until his voice gave out. He was inconsolable. They brought him back to Graceland, but the house had changed instantly. The light had gone out. The golden era was over. The structure was the same, the white columns, the music gates, the blue paint, but the spirit of the place had been carried out in a hearse. Elvis wandered the halls, dazed, medicated, looking for her. He collapsed on the stairs. He sat in her room, smelling her clothes, refusing to let the maids touch anything. This was the pivot point. This was the moment Graceland stopped being a home and started becoming a mausoleum. Elvis eventually went to Germany to serve his tour of duty, but the boy who left was not the man who came back. He returned with a darkness in him, a hole that nothing, not the pills, not the women, not the applause could ever fill. He returned to a house that was now a shrine to the woman who had died there. He kept her room exactly as she had left it. Her clothes hung in the closet. Her cigarette case sat on the nightstand. For the next 20 years until his own death, Elvis would ensure that Gladys's presence was preserved in amber. The psychological shift was profound. Without Gladys to ground him, without her to tell him no, without her unconditional love to offset the transactional love of the industry, Elvis began to drift. He began to build the walls higher. He began to surround himself with the Memphis Mafia, men who were paid to agree with him, replacing the mother who had loved him enough to correct him. The sanctuary of 1957 began to morph into the fortress of the 1960s and 70s. The open gates were closed. The guards were doubled. The nocturnal lifestyle began to take hold. Elvis was trying to recreate the feeling of safety he had when she was alive, but he was doing it with artificial means. Graceland became a place of suspended animation. It was the physical manifestation of his grief. He couldn't bear to change the things she loved, yet he needed to fill the void with more stuff, more people, more noise. The rooms began to fill with the clutter of a man trying to buy his way out of depression. The simplicity of the farmhouse was slowly buried under layers of velvet, shag carpet, and gold leaf. But underneath the gaudy decorations, the silence of August 14, 1958 remained. He had kept his promise. He had bought her the house on the hill. He had bought her the Cadillac. He had taken care of everything, but in doing so, he had brought her into the very spotlight that killed her. The mansion was supposed to be the ultimate expression of his love, the reward for their years of suffering. Instead, it became the setting for her decline. And for Elvis, the house became a paradoxical space. It was the only place he felt close to her, so he could never leave it. But it was also the place where he lost her, so he could never truly be happy there. He was the king of the castle, but the queen was dead. And as the 1960s dawned and the world changed, Elvis locked the doors, turned up the music, and began the long, slow retreat into the upstairs bedroom, trying to hide from a world that no longer made sense without her by his side. The gilded cage was locked. The key was buried with her, and the long descent into the darkness was about to begin. By the time the calendar turned to the 1970s, the ghost of the farmhouse on the hill had vanished completely. In its place stood a psychedelic fortress, a sprawling, shag-carpeted testament to a mind that was slowly untethering from reality. If the 1950s were the black and white years of innocence and promise, the 70s were the years of Technicolor chaos. Elvis Presley had returned to the stage in Las Vegas, reclaiming his crown as the king of rock and roll. But the man who came home to Memphis between tours was not the vibrant youth who had played football on the lawn. He was a king in exile, retreating further and further into the shadows of a home that was morphing to match his internal disorder. Graceland was no longer just a residence, it was a state of mind, and that mind was becoming increasingly clouded by paranoia, boredom, and a chemical fog that never lifted. The most visceral symbol of this transformation was the jungle room. Located at the back of the house, in what used to be a screened-in porch where Gladys had once sat to catch a breeze, Elvis created a space that defied all logic and taste. It was a room designed to look like a Polynesian paradise, but it felt more like a claustrophobic cave. He covered the floor in green shag carpet. He covered the ceiling in the same green shag carpet, creating the sensation of being inside a moss-covered box. The furniture was massive, carved from heavy wood in the shape of animals and tiki gods, upholstered in fake fur. He installed a working waterfall on one wall that trickled constantly, adding a humid, swampy dampness to the air. It was a room that had no windows to the outside world, a room where it was impossible to tell if it was noon or midnight. It was here, in this artificial jungle, that the king held court. He would sit for hours in the oversized armchair, surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, eating mounds of hamburgers and watching 3 television sets at once, waiting for a dawn he refused to see. The architecture of the house had been weaponized to support a vampire lifestyle. Elvis had developed a phobia of the sun. He slept all day and lived all night, a schedule that required the total modification of his environment. He ordered the windows of the master suite and the main living areas to be covered with heavy aluminum foil, taped to the glass to ensure that not a single photon of sunlight could penetrate his sanctuary. Over the foil went the blackout drapes. The result was a house that existed in perpetual twilight. The staff at Graceland learned to move in silence. Vacuuming was forbidden until the king rang the buzzer. Meals were prepared at 3 in the morning. The adapa rhythm of the world outside, the traffic on Elvis Presley Boulevard, the school buses, the office workers, ceased to exist. Inside the walls, time was measured only by Elvis's moods and his medication schedule. This isolation was maintained by the Memphis Mafia, a brotherhood of bodyguards, cousins, and friends who had been with him since the beginning. They were the knights of his round table, but they were also his jailers. They wore matching rings. They carried guns. They laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. They were on the payroll, which created a dangerous dynamic. How do you tell a man no when he holds the deed to your house and the keys to your car? They loved him, certainly, but they also depended on him for their very existence. They became the buffer zone between Elvis and reality. If Elvis wanted to go to the movies, they didn't just buy tickets. They rented the entire Memphian theater at midnight. If Elvis wanted to go to an amusement park, they rented Libertyland after hours. He never had to wait in line. He never had to pay a bill. He never had to interact with a human being who wasn't vetted, searched, and approved. He was the center of a solar system that revolved solely to keep him happy. But happiness was the one thing that couldn't be manufactured. Underpinning this nocturnal existence was the shadow of Dr. George Nicopolis, known to the inner circle as Dr. Nick. He was a doctor who had sworn an oath to do no harm, but he became the architect of Elvis's decline. Elvis did not see himself as an addict. In his mind, addicts were people who bought heroin on street corners. He was a wealthy man who took medicine prescribed by a licensed physician. It was a delusion that the entire household participated in. There were pills to wake up, pills to sleep, pills to kill the pain of the glaucoma that was ravaging his eyes, pills to settle his stomach, and pills to calm his nerves. Dr. Nick would arrive with his black bag, dispensing packets of colorful capsules like candy. The attack kits, as they were called, accompanied Elvis everywhere. The physical toll was horrific. The lean, dangerous sexuality of the 1968 comeback special dissolved into a bloated, sweating caricature. He gained weight rapidly, his body retaining water from the massive doses of steroids and sedatives. He would sometimes stumble on stage, slurring his words, clinging to the microphone stand for support, while the Memphis Mafia watched from the wings, terrified that tonight would be the night he fell. The toxicity of this lifestyle eventually corroded the one relationship that had offered him a lifeline to normalcy, his marriage to Priscilla. She had arrived at Graceland as a teenager, the fairy tale princess in the ivory tower, but she found herself living in a circus. She tried to be the wife he wanted. She dyed her hair black to match his. She wore the clothes he picked out. She stayed up all night with him, trying to keep pace with his mania. But by the early 70s, the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't raise their daughter, Lisa Marie, in a house where guns were left on coffee tables and people slept until 4 in the afternoon. She couldn't compete with the entourage that swarmed the house at all hours. The intimacy of a marriage requires privacy, and privacy was the one commodity Elvis refused to buy. In 1973, the fairy tale shattered. Priscilla filed for divorce. The day she left was the day the last window in Elvis's soul was boarded up. He was devastated. The king, who could have any woman in the world, had been left by the only one who truly knew him. The divorce triggered a downward spiral that accelerated the darkness at Graceland. The parties got louder, but the laughter got colder. He began to date a string of beauty queens and young women, but they were merely visitors in his world, ornaments to distract him from the silence. He became increasingly obsessed with guns and law enforcement. He collected badges. He carried a pistol in his boot, one in his waistband, and kept an assault rifle by the bed. He would sometimes shoot out the television set if a program annoyed him, a violent outburst that the Memphis Mafia would laugh off as Elvis being Elvis, simply replacing the TV the next day. It was a behavior that signaled a deep, frantic boredom. He was a man with immense energy and nowhere to direct it. The upstairs of Graceland, the master suite, became the only world that mattered. It was a space that few people ever saw. It was a suite of rooms decorated in red and black velvet, with a massive bed that looked more like a stage prop than a place to sleep. There was a refrigerator stocked with Pepsi and brown sugar pound cake. There were stacks of spiritual books. Elvis was searching desperately for meaning, reading about numerology, theosophy, and the Bible, trying to figure out why God had chosen him to be the vessel for all this fame. He would sit in the middle of the bed, surrounded by books and pill bottles, weeping and praying, while downstairs the tourists peered through the gates, imagining a life of perfect bliss. The disconnect between the public image and the private reality was absolute. To the world, he was a god. To himself, he was a lonely, frightened man who couldn't sleep without a chemical hammer. Even his toys lost their luster. He bought a Convair 880 jet, named it the Lisa Marie, and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars outfitting it with gold-plated seatbelt buckles and a master bedroom. It was his flying mansion, a way to take the bubble of Graceland into the stratosphere. But even at 30,000 feet, he couldn't escape himself. He would fly to Denver just to buy a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a frantic, meaningless exertion of power just to prove he could do it. The plane would sit on the tarmac in Memphis, engines ready, waiting for a command that often never came. He would get dressed to go out, put on the jewelry and the gun holster, walk down the stairs to the foyer, look at the door, and then turn around and go back up. The anxiety of leaving the house was becoming paralyzing. The world outside was too chaotic, too demanding, too real. Inside Graceland, he was the king. Outside, he was a spectacle, so he stayed inside. As the mid-70s ground on, the atmosphere in the house became heavy, with a sense of impending doom. The staff could feel it. The Memphis Mafia could feel it. Vernon Presley, sick with heart trouble himself, could feel it. Elvis was visibly dying. His performances were becoming erratic. He would ramble on stage about his jewelry or karate. He would cancel shows. He was hospitalized repeatedly for exhaustion, a euphemism that fooled no one in the inner circle. Yet, the machine kept running. The tours were booked. The records were released. The money had to be made because Elvis spent it as fast as it came in. He gave away Cadillacs to strangers. He paid for the entourage's houses. He was generous to a fault, buying love because he didn't know how else to get it. The estate was cash poor, bleeding money to support the kingdom, which meant the king had to keep working. He was a prisoner of his own payroll. The jungle room, with its leaking waterfall and green carpet, became the studio for his final recordings. RCA brought the mobile recording trucks to Graceland because they couldn't get him to come to the studio in Nashville. They ran cables through the windows and set up microphones among the tiki furniture. Elvis stood there, heavy and tired, singing songs like Hurt and Way Down. His voice was still powerful, a majestic instrument that had deepened with age and pain, but the eyes above the microphone were vacant. He was singing to the green shag carpet. He was singing to the ghosts of the past. He was singing from the bottom of a well. The sessions were difficult. He would lose interest, walk away, go back upstairs. The producers had to coax him, plead with him, just to get a few minutes of tape. It was the sound of a man trying to wring the last drops of magic out of a soul that had run dry. By the summer of 1977, the walls of Graceland were the only horizon Elvis Presley knew. The aluminum foil on the windows reflected the heat of the Memphis summer, turning the house into a kiln. The pills were no longer working to kill the pain. They were just maintaining the numbness. He was bored with the movies, bored with the songs, bored with the life. He told a backup singer, "I'm so tired of being Elvis Presley." It was the ultimate confession. The character he had created, the sneering, hip-shaking icon, had consumed the man. There was no room left for Elvis, the human being. There was only the king, trapped in his castle, waiting for the fall. The jungle room was silent. The waterfall trickled on. And upstairs, the bathroom door was unlocked, waiting for the final scene of the tragedy to play out. The isolation was complete. The boy from Tupelo had climbed the mountain, built the fortress, and pulled up the drawbridge, only to realize that he had locked himself in with the very demons he was trying to escape. The funeral of Elvis Presley on August 18, 1977, was not a ceremony. It was a seismic event that shook the foundations of American culture. The Memphis sun beat down on the pavement of Elvis Presley Boulevard with a relentless, blinding intensity, baking the asphalt until it radiated heat like a griddle. Outside the music gates, the crowd had swelled to biblical proportions. Tens of thousands of men in work boots, women in Sunday hats, teenagers in T-shirts, pressed against the white limestone walls, a weeping, heaving mass of humanity that stretched for miles. They had come to say goodbye to a man they had never met, but felt they knew better than their own husbands. Inside the gates, the atmosphere was a surreal mix of Southern Gothic grief and Hollywood spectacle. The white Cadillac hearse waited in the driveway, its engine idling, ready to carry the boy from Tupelo on his final ride to Forest Hill Cemetery. The procession was a spectacle of excess that Elvis himself might have choreographed. 17 white limousines followed the hearse. The flowers alone were a logistical nightmare. Over 3,000 floral arrangements had been sent from around the world, creating a literal mountain of blooms that buried the lawn in a riot of color. There were guitars made of roses, broken hearts made of carnations, and hound dogs made of orchids. It was gaudy, it was loud, and it was profoundly sad. Vernon Presley, broken and sobbing, rode in the lead car, a father burying a son who had become too big for the world to hold. As the cortege moved slowly through the streets of Memphis, people fainted in the heat. They threw themselves at the cars. It was mass hysteria, a collective release of grief for the end of the American century's youth. But once the flowers wilted and the television cameras packed up and went home, a cold, hard reality settled over Graceland. The king was dead, but the Bills were very much alive. The financial situation of the Elvis Presley estate in late 1977 was catastrophic. To the outside world, Elvis was a billionaire. He had sold 1 billion records. He had made 31 movies. He was the highest-paid entertainer in history. But the truth was far more precarious. Elvis was a cash flow machine, not an investor. He had spent money with a manic generosity that defied accounting. He bought fleets of cars for friends. He paid for strangers' hospital bills. He maintained a payroll of dozens of people who did little more than hang around and laugh at his jokes. The maintenance of Graceland itself, the electricity, the staff, the security, the private planes, cost $500,000 a year in 1970s money. When the accountants finally opened the books, they stared into an abyss. There was very little cash in the bank. The vast majority of his earnings had been spent as fast as they came in. Even worse, the Internal Revenue Service was circling like a pack of wolves. The estate faced an inheritance tax bill that was estimated at over $10 million. The liquid assets were nowhere near enough to cover it. The Memphis Mafia was disbanded, their salaries cut off, leaving them to wander away into obscurity or to write tell-all books for a quick buck. Vernon Presley, who had been named the executor of the estate, was ill and overwhelmed. He was a simple man, a former truck driver who was now tasked with managing a collapsing multinational brand. He did his best to hold the line, but when he died of heart failure in 1979, the last line of defense crumbled. The estate passed to Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie. But Lisa Marie was a child, just 11 years old. The legal guardianship and the management of the estate fell to her mother, Priscilla Presley. Priscilla stepped into a boardroom filled with bankers, lawyers, and financial advisors who looked at her with the condescension reserved for ex-wives of rock stars. They laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The estate was bleeding to death. The taxes were due. The only asset of significant value that could be liquidated quickly was the house. Their advice was unanimous: sell Graceland. The bankers pitched it as the only logical solution. They suggested selling the mansion to the city of Memphis to be used as a museum, or perhaps selling the land to a developer who would bulldoze the house and turn the 13 acres into a subdivision or a shopping mall. They argued that the upkeep was unsustainable. They argued that Elvis's popularity would fade, that he was a relic of the 50s who would be forgotten by the next generation. They saw Graceland as a liability, a white elephant with a leaking roof and a tacky jungle room that no serious investor would want. Priscilla Presley looked at the suits, and she said no. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. She knew what the house meant. She knew it wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was the physical embodiment of Elvis's soul. To sell it would be to erase him. She also understood something the bankers didn't: the emotional connection of the fans. She had seen the crowds at the gates. She had seen the candlelight vigils. She knew that people didn't just want to hear the music. They wanted to touch the hem of the garment. They wanted to see where the king lived. She proposed a radical idea: open Graceland to the public. Turn it into a tourist attraction on the scale of Hearst Castle or the Biltmore Estate. The skepticism was palpable. The elite cultural critics sneered at the idea. They viewed Graceland as a temple of kitsch, a monument to bad taste with its shag carpets and ceramic monkeys. Who would pay to see that? But Priscilla ignored them. She hired a sharp marketing executive named Jack Soden, and together they bet the last of the estate's liquid cash, about $500,000, on retrofitting the mansion for tours. It was a frantic race against bankruptcy. They had to build ticket booths, hire guides, pave parking lots, and navigate the zoning laws of a residential neighborhood that was terrified of the traffic. They had to secure the insurance. They had to preserve the rooms exactly as Elvis had left them, turning a private home into a museum without destroying the atmosphere of a sanctuary. On June 7, 1982, the gates of Graceland swung open to the public. Priscilla and Jack Soden stood by, holding their breath, wondering if anyone would show up. They didn't have to wait long. The response was a tsunami. 3,000 people walked through the house on the first day. They lined up for hours in the Memphis heat, clutching their tickets like holy relics. They walked in silence through the living room with the white peacock-stained glass. They stared in awe at the jungle room. They wept in the trophy room, where the gold records lined the walls. They filed past the meditation garden, where Elvis and Gladys were buried side by side. The cash registers rang and rang. In the first month, they made back their entire investment. By the end of the first year, hundreds of thousands of people had visited. The opening of Graceland didn't just save the estate, it transformed it. The cash-poor inheritance became a billion-dollar enterprise. Priscilla's gamble secured the financial future of Lisa Marie Presley and her children for generations. Graceland became the second most visited private home in the United States, surpassed only by the White House. It became a pilgrimage site, an American Mecca where fans from Tokyo, London, and Rio de Janeiro converged to pay homage to the boy who changed the world. The bankers who had advised selling the house were silenced. The tacky mansion was now a National Historic Landmark. But there is a profound and dark irony to this success. Elvis Presley bought Graceland in 1957 for one specific reason: privacy. He wanted a wall between him and the world. He wanted a place where he could walk in his pajamas without being photographed. He spent 20 years building fences, planting trees, and hiring guards to keep the fans out. He died in the bathroom because it was the only room left with a lock. And now, in death, the doors are permanently open. 600,000 strangers walk through his living room every single year. They stare at his television sets. They look at his china. They walk across the lawn where he played football. The very thing he craved most, solitude, was the price his estate paid for survival. The house he built to escape the spotlight became the ultimate spotlight. Yet, even in this public exposure, the estate keeps one final secret. The tour of Graceland ends at the bottom of the stairs. The upstairs, the master suite, the bedroom, the dressing room, and the bathroom where he died remains off-limits. It is the forbidden zone. Since August 16, 1977, almost no one has set foot in those rooms. The family has preserved it exactly as it was. The record remains on the turntable. The styrofoam cup remains on the shelf. The bed is still made. It is a ghost ship sailing on the second floor, frozen in the amber of 1971. This decision preserves the mystery. It allows the king a shred of the dignity he lost in his final moments. The fans can see the gold records, they can see the jumpsuits, but they cannot see the human being. They cannot see the medicine bottles or the books on the nightstand. The upstairs represents the man. The downstairs represents the myth, and the myth is what pays the bills. Today, Graceland stands as a complex contradiction. It is a commercial juggernaut, a slick operation with shuttle buses, iPad tours, and gift shops selling Elvis socks and Elvis hot sauce. But if you strip away the commerce, if you stand in the meditation garden, in the quiet of the evening when the crowds have gone, the tragedy of the place reasserts itself. It is a house built on love for a mother who died too young. It is a house that trapped a man who became too famous to live. It is a symbol of the American dream in all its glory and all its horror. Elvis proved that in America, you can rise from a dirt floor shack to a limestone mansion. You can conquer the world with a guitar and a sneer, but you cannot outrun your own shadow. The story of the Elvis Presley estate is the ultimate dark fairy tale. The king is gone. The daughter who inherited the kingdom has now joined him in the meditation garden, buried next to her son. The lineage is tragic, marked by early death and immense sorrow. But the house remains. The white columns still gleam. The music gates still stand. And every morning, the staff unlocks the doors, and the world pours in, searching for the face of the man who tried to hide from them, and in doing so, became theirs forever. The dark story of Graceland is that it was a home that killed the man who lived there, only to save the family he left behind. The mortgage was paid in full, but the cost was absolute, and in the silence of the sealed-off upper floor, the king finally sleeps, safe at last in the only darkness money couldn't buy.